Hello, welcome to the Massachusetts General Hospital Frontotemporal Disorders Unit Community Forum Friday webinar session. My name is Katie Brandt. I'm the Director of Caregiver Support Services and Public Relations, and I'll be your host for today's session. Today, we'll be looking at resources for young-onset dementia, a conversation with Nicole McGurin, Program and Services Director from the Alzheimer's Association, and Rhiana Kohl, Caregiver and Alzheimer's disease advocate. This is an incredibly important topic for our community, as we know that many of the individuals connected with our MGH FTD unit are living with young onset diagnoses. There are many special considerations when you're younger and receiving a diagnosis that may lead to dementia. And we hope that by talking with our community expert and a caregiver today, that we can help you know more about the services, supports, education, and advocacy opportunities available to you. Nicole, welcome to our program.
Thank you for inviting me, Katie.
You know, we're thrilled to have you today, and especially because the Alzheimer's Association is such a powerhouse in the space. And I really wanted you to come and talk about your role and really the role of the Alzheimer's Association to support families living with those young onset diagnoses.
Thank you, Katie. It's really important for us to share the support and services that are available to families who are dealing with younger onset dementia. And the first thing I'd like to highlight is that although our name is the Alzheimer's Association, we do help families dealing with any kind of dementia. And even families who maybe don't have an official diagnosis yet, we're there for them as well. And as you had asked, in my role at the Alzheimer's Association, I oversee our 24/7 helpline and care consultation services, as well as our support groups and education programs, particularly in the greater Boston area. But now that we're virtual, those programs are really available to anyone across the state of Massachusetts and really throughout New England. And I've been fortunate in my time at the Alzheimer's Association to have been involved with a younger onset support group for many years. I've had the opportunity to travel to Washington, D.C. with our younger onset advocates to march on the Hill and press for change, and had a lot of different opportunities throughout my time here to really get to know a lot of younger onset families.
And you know, as a professional, Nicole, did you start your career working with individuals on a range, like the whole age range, or is working with younger onset families something that happened later as services developed at the Alzheimer's Association?
So when I came to the Alzheimer's Association, I was hired to be their early stage program manager. So my focus was on families who had been newly diagnosed. And that had existed for a couple of years at the association. And you know, at that time, many of the people who were diagnosed young enough to take advantage of those services were people with younger onset dementia. And the Alzheimer's Association has been involved in providing support groups specifically for this group for more than 20 years. And those programs and services have definitely expanded throughout the years as we've learned more and been able to reach more people. But we've really been, I think, a pioneer in making a special effort to make sure we're meeting the needs of this special group.
It is a special group. And, you know, I talk about this a lot, that receiving a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease or related dementia can be very isolating. And then if you have a young onset or an atypical dementia, you might even feel more excluded, as I think general public opinion thinks about Alzheimer's disease and dementia as something that affects older families. So it is, I think, an important message for people to know that not only does the Alzheimer's Association work with younger families, but this isn't something new for you guys. You know, you have a lot of experience doing it. So, Nicole, when I think about the Alzheimer's Association, I think of you guys providing support, education, and advocacy. Do you want to talk a little bit about like those three buckets, like what are some of the services related to supports for families, especially those young onset families?
Sure. So what I'd like to highlight among all of our services really is our 24/7 helpline, which is available any time of day, as the name says, at 800-272-3900. It's also available on our website, alz.org, where people can email questions, they can live chat their questions. So there's a lot of options to reach out. And through the 24/7 helpline, people can get those answers and guidance around the really unique circumstances that they are in. There's a lot of great information out there on the web and including on our website, but for all types of Alzheimer's, but particularly younger onset, this affects every family differently. And I think it's really important that families reach out, share what's going on in their particular circumstances, and get that kind of individualized, tailored advice, which is what they'll get at the 24/7 helpline. There are live experts there, there are licensed clinicians who have the time to spend to talk through what issues people are experiencing. So I really highly recommend that, even if people don't have a question, they don't have to come with a specific question. As long as they're willing to share what's going on with them, we can ask them some questions and give them some guidance and give them support. So I think that's always my first recommendation to families. And that's where they can find out about the education programs and support groups that are available. I mentioned when I was introducing myself that I was involved with a younger onset support group. So we have support groups for both caregivers of people with younger onset dementia, as well as people living with younger onset dementia as well. And those groups were very vital before the pandemic, but they've continued to be in the virtual space. And we've actually expanded the number of those groups available during this time. And people will find people in a similar situation from across the country being a part of these groups. And they've really been of great assistance. And there's also education programs available as well. Some of them specific to issues with younger onset, other ones that are more general, but certainly include a lot of very helpful advice on communication skills, on dealing with difficult conversations, managing behavior challenges that are available for both caregivers as well as people living with Alzheimer's or other dementia when it's in the early stages.
I really appreciate that you're pointing out that there are services targeted to the experience that you're having, right? Because as a care partner, you might have very different questions than if you're the person living with the diagnosis. And I've had the opportunity to work with some amazing advocates who are themselves living with the diagnosis, and they have expressed so clearly that they have a voice. They have questions, they have a need for support. So I was wondering if you have a message as a clinician, Nicole, right? You're a professional in the community. Do you have a message to other professionals when they're thinking about working with families? What are some of the things that they can think about that they can do to support those families in their professional role?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is to not make any assumptions and be open to listening to what families are interested in doing. I think sometimes, sometimes there may be an assumption that someone wants to be private about their situation or doesn't want to share that. But I think to give people that opportunity and talk with them about, what would make a difference for them to help them cope. And to get a chance to learn about, what they came to this diagnosis with. I mean, people have had jobs, they've had interests, they have families. And a lot of times, people may have this diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, but, for instance, if they've had a past career as a teacher, they may enjoy presenting and sharing their experience and feel very comfortable to still do that. So I think to certainly make sure people are aware of what those opportunities are and to take the time to listen to learn, what each person's really unique circumstance will be.
I love that. It really goes along with the value that I hold around person-centered care planning, which thinks a lot about personhood and values and goals of care and really individualizes the approach and focuses on that partnership. between clinician and person with the diagnosis and family.
Absolutely. And I think, and giving the person with the diagnosis also the opportunity to, share what they would like to see happen. I think sometimes, there can still be a tendency to, maybe only talk to the caregiver or talk to the caregiver more often. And I think, it's really important to talk to a family together and approach questions to everyone who is in the room, about what's going on, and be sure to include everyone in the conversation. And you may need to make some adaptations to allow the person with dementia to maybe understand the questions, maybe more time to respond to those, but to definitely, take that time and have that sensitivity.
I mean, I'm hearing from you really an overarching message of inclusivity, not just for clinicians to work with the dyad, the family, but also I'm hearing that message of inclusivity from the Alzheimer's Association, right? That you welcome people with a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, you welcome diagnoses of related dementias, and it doesn't matter how old you are when you receive that diagnosis, that you are welcome at the Alzheimer's Association.
Absolutely. And the other thing I think I would say to clinicians to keep in mind, and I would say for caregivers and people living with Alzheimer's to keep in mind too, is that you also have the opportunity to talk to members of that group one-on-one too. I think it's important for all parties to have a chance to ask their questions and share their concerns, and not have to temper those thoughts, because they're worried they're going to offend the person who's diagnosed, or the person who's diagnosed is worried they're going to scare their care partner. So it's really important to set up opportunities for people to be able to also share things privately as well.
I think that just goes directly back to what you just said about not making assumptions, right? So don't make the assumption that the care partner or the person with the diagnosis is comfortable saying everything in a group setting. And vice versa, maybe they will say, oh, no, I don't need to be alone. We're totally open. But my experience is sometimes that changes depending on the worries or the questions that are on someone's mind.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, so you've told us about how folks can access the services. I love the hotline. I think that's something that is important to just emphasize that you already said, which is it's staffed by clinicians, people who really have training in these delicate areas. And also something about the Alzheimer's Association that is so wonderful is all of the services are free for families. So really knowing that resources don't have to be a barrier to accessing services, education, and support.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I think the other point I would just add about our services as well that I haven't talked about yet is just what's available virtually right now. I did mention support groups and education programs, but I urge people to look at our website. There is a special section on younger onset dementia, and there's also a really great section for children and teens. That's such a huge issue for many families who are dealing with younger onset, where they may be caregiving and parenting. And I will say, I especially give a shout out to the part of the website that deals with teens. There's some really great videos featuring teens who have parents who have younger onset dementia at each stage, talking about how they coped, how they were able to help their families. And that's a really great resource for people. And we also do, for people that may not have the time or the comfort with a support group that's kind of one-to-one, we have a virtual online community called All's Connected, where people can reach out and connect in perhaps a more private way for people that might be more comfortable.
Yeah, again, it's really that individuality, right? And thinking about what works for you, even I think at different phases of living with your disease. So I've heard from caregivers that they've appreciated participating in education, webinars, or those online forums, maybe early before they were ready to say, hey, I'm a caregiver, and show up at a support group. And that's made me really think a lot about how important it is to offer that array of services and supports. this is a really complex journey for so many families. And I think that the menu of services and the range that the Alzheimer's Association offers really reflects that.
Yeah. And I think the other way that sometimes people come to us at the association, and as you indicate, there's no correct order. We meet a lot of younger onset families actually through our advocacy and our public awareness and fundraising events. Sometimes people don't feel like they either need or are ready to reach out for that kind of personal support. And instead, they might become involved with us, because they decide they want to be a part of the walk to end Alzheimer's and have a team that raises money, in honor of a person who's been diagnosed, or they've become more with advocacy efforts, and they've gone to Washington, D.C. to talk to their representative about their story to try to encourage, more funding for research. So there's a lot of different ways that people find hope, find support, and get connected to the cause. And again, sometimes that's where people start, and sometimes they go there after they've talked to us on the helpline.
Well, I know that our caregiver will talk about the opportunities for advocacy as well, but Nicole, I also have had that opportunity to be in DC and see everyone in the purple sashes, and it is so emotional to see this army of families who are all united in this, shared goal of finding treatment and a cure for Alzheimer's and related dementia. It makes you feel like we're not powerless, right? We can channel our energy into something that is going to make an impact. And I think that that's a very important thing to acknowledge, that, right now, if we don't have disease modifying treatments or a cure, but families still want to do something. They want to feel like they're supporting their loved one or educating themselves or empowering themselves. And for many, just starting with those advocacy and community events can be a great way to do it.
Yes, it is. I think, and all those things you pointed out are so important. I think the rewards that families get from it, but they also get support. Seeing support from the whole community, not just from an individual support group. And it's also an opportunity, even just on a more casual level, to meet other people in the same situation as you. And just to maybe spend time together socially, not as a support group, and that's a very big benefit as well.
Well, we talk about this, even I'll use the MGHFTD unit has an annual gala. And for 5 years, that gala was in person before the pandemic. And we always have a live band and a dance floor. And I remember talking to an adult daughter who was a caregiver, and she looked sort of worried. She's watching her mom dancing with wild abandon on the dance floor. And she said, "Oh boy, my mom's really dancing kind of outrageously." And I said, "Yeah, and look, other people are joining her. No one is staring.
Yeah.
We accept that here." And I think that social piece of just feeling normal, accepted, and welcome, that's so important too.
I definitely agree. And I think the final thing I would recommend or talk about in terms of ways that families with younger onset can find support and meaning would be, getting involved in research opportunities. And I know, Mass General offers many of these, and lots of the hospitals in this area do. But that really has been a really meaningful way. A lot of families that I have worked with have found support, have found a way to fight back. And I think that obviously there's the opportunity for possible treatment, which is hugely important. But I think that other piece of playing a part in hopefully, the cure for these diseases can be really empowering for families.
Yeah. And, that's the only way we're going to make it happen is together. Because, I even think about how, hey, I'm not a scientist, but I can be an advocate. I can help to raise awareness and funds, or help my loved one donate their brain for research, or participate by driving them to a research appointment. It's, we all can play a part, and that's what it's going to take, I think, to get us to that stage of treatment and one day a cure. Well, Nicole, it's great to have you with us today. Do you have a takeaway message, something that you hope our young onset families will carry away from this webinar session today?
I think my biggest word of advice would be to not go this journey alone. To find a way, whatever works for you and your family, to meet other people in the same situation, to get support, and to find some meaning in your journey.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you for being an expert and a support in our community, and thank you for the work that you're doing with families.
You're welcome, and thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of the program.
Nicole provided us with wonderful information about how we can access tangible services and supports through the Alzheimer's Association. But I knew that today's session would not be complete without an authentic voice. So I'm thrilled to welcome Rhiana Kohl, caregiver and Alzheimer's disease advocate, to our session today. Rhiana, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Having lived through so much of this, it's really important for me to share any information I can to help anybody else who has to go through this horrific journey. My husband was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's when he was 47. He's now 56, and he was misdiagnosed for 2 years. So he was quite young, and our children at the time were 10 and 12. They're now 19 and 21, but they literally spent 13 years watching their father decline. He's now been in a nursing home for 3 years, but as I said, he's still young. He's only 56. So that was our experience. There was also some financial mismanagement, so that certainly factored in for our story as well. What I wanted to say was that people will often say Alzheimer's is different for everybody, which is absolutely true. But there are also a lot of similarities. So I think it is important for people to share and to learn from each other, and to know particularly that they're not alone, because it can be such an isolating disease and there's so much misinformation out there. So the learning curve is huge for those going through it directly and those that you deal with, the general public. People associate Alzheimer's with being a senior geriatric disease, which certainly is, but there's a whole community of people with the early onset disease coming with different needs and a different experience. But it's not unique that there are many of us out there who, have are caregivers who that are working full time because we're still of a working age, who have children even that are still at home, and even elderly parents. So it can be a very different experience in terms of early onset and having the young children. And it's a very isolating disease for someone often experiencing it, as well as those of us who are caregivers. But it feels like it's really isolating and misunderstood when your loved one is younger and has the early onset disease. For me, it was really important to, I didn't really realize this at first, but to get involved in some sort of community. And that can be different for anybody. So there are so many opportunities that you don't kind of realize until it comes into your life. For me, I was very active with the Alzheimer's Association, and who does offer support groups for those with early onset Alzheimer's. Initially, dual approach where the caregivers are in one group and those afflicted with the disease are in another group. And that was extremely beneficial, and then has carried out. I'm still active with that. And so not only was that an opportunity to, talk to others, meet others, form that sense of community, which I now have what I would consider lifelong friends going forward from all those shared experiences, and a real social network. But also it's an opportunity to learn, and that word of mouth of communication of all these different other information, other resources, other opportunities, including just things that you can do with your loved one. So there's lots of activities that the Alzheimer's Association provides, in terms of that are appropriate, in terms of meetups and things that you can do together. We learned about things that some of the museums offer, programs for people with dementia. And that was another place where then I had my sort of museum community. And my husband really loved to go just to sort of go and have the experience, not necessarily the activity at hand, but just see those people and have that routine. There's memory cafes that he also enjoyed. And one of the things I think is true for anybody with any form of dementia is it varies as how self-aware the person is about their disease or not. My husband was one of those, or is one of those people who understands that he was diagnosed with the disease, but didn't really fully understand how it was impacting him, and resisted being told that, he might have any limitations. So navigating that was always tricky, and it was always helpful to have other people to navigate that with. So that was great. And then for me, I work full time. I have elderly parents that I cared for. My father just passed away, but my mother still is with us and needs some support. And then, as I said, I basically was functioning as a single parent. So my time was precious. But for me, getting involved as an advocate, speaking out, trying to change some of the legislation, inform, really speak out to legislators, state, federal, go to Washington, was just, it really functioned to serve me and my family and our community on many levels, in terms of, again, feeling part of a community, feeling like I could make change. There's so much work to be done to change the status of Alzheimer's. There's so many different avenues to do that. And people should really think about what, if anything, they'd be comfortable doing. There's fundraising, there's work and research. I know my husband and many of his peers who also had forms of dementia were very interested in research and being part of clinical trials, or anything they could do where they felt like they were making a difference.
Rhiana, I've had the experience of being able to see you. You are a tenacious advocate. And I think that part of how it comes across so strongly is because you speak so unabashedly about what the experience is like. You've been so open and honest. And I remember some of those sessions when we were advocating for House Bill 4116, an act relative to Alzheimer's and related dementia, and just really asking for that recognition of the lived experience of individuals in Massachusetts living with Alzheimer's and related dementia, to acknowledge the need for services and supports. And you just mentioned so many, but what I was hearing was a lot of services from the Alzheimer's Association. And of course, that's wonderful, but, really advocating what other services did you benefit or would you have benefited from? As a young family, you mentioned you were working. Did you have care for your husband during the day so that you could focus on your professional role?
Yeah, unfortunately, we really didn't qualify for care. And like I said, part of my husband's disease involved him mismanaging our finances. So some things are based on income, some things are based on assets, but that made it really challenging. And just a note on that, navigating the public sector system in terms of what those kind of resources you have is very, very challenging. And, I'm fortunate that I am comfortable speaking out. And even just navigating bureaucracy, paperwork, speaking English, that being my first language, not being ashamed. And unfortunately, a lot of people are challenged by those. So given all those attributes that I have, it still was just heartbreakingly challenging and confusing. And it felt, that's just my feeling. It almost felt intentional, like that just the world was just not going to make this easy for me to get help. So no, I didn't get a lot of formal help. I was able to try to get informal help. Fortunately, my job was able to be a little flexible. And then some family and friends certainly were helpful. But like I said, it can be really tricky because when you're on the younger side, most of your peers are also working. They also have children at home to take care of. And even though they're very well intentioned, what do you need for help? And I did want to comment on that because that's something that, in retrospect, I might have done differently. A lot of people say, I want to help. And you're sort of thinking, well, what does that mean? And that, what does that mean for them? And what does that mean for you? And it wasn't necessarily pride, but I think that plays a factor. But for me personally, um, I didn't necessarily understand what would be helpful to me and communicate that well. And I also was afraid that eventually I was going to need more help. And if I asked for too much help early on, then I kind of would have used all my, clout. And then when I really needed help, then I would have used it all up. And that's just not true. But I do think that most people were genuinely offering, they just didn't know how. And I think that my assumption was that it had to be directly related to helping my husband and directly related to the disease. And I think in retrospect, I should have given more attention to what would help me help him, what would help my family help him, and all of us. And that might have been, making food or helping with even transportation, because that was an issue. He was sort of the driver. And when you have kids, you know that that's really basically half your job, especially in the teen years. You're just a chaperone. But things like that, where and helping and spending time with him so that he wasn't alone. And socialization is so important, and just getting out of the house and walking and exercising and all those things that I think a lot of people would have been interested in doing. But it's hard to ask for that and really make it happen. So that was something that I've done a lot, and I'm pleased with being resourceful and trying to figure out what was out there. But some things you have to ask for, and that could be really hard.
You brought up so many important points, but I want to really call out this idea of asking for help and just how incredibly difficult it is. But this idea of what type of help. And, I think that there are other parents in the community who probably would have been willing to drive your kids to their soccer practice or their math tutor. Folks who maybe would be willing to pay for your lawn to get mowed, or maybe chip in to get your house cleaned once in a while. I think that there are many people who genuinely want to help, but they themselves say, gee, well, I'm not equipped to care for someone living with Alzheimer's disease, but boy, I could make a lasagna on the first Monday of every month. And it's really, I think, we've coached caregivers, like, make a list and put that out to your friends. There's a wonderful website, Lots of Helping Hands, where people can put the needs they have, and then your different friends and family could sign up. But I think, unfortunately, these are things that we learn later, right? You can't be good at everything all at once.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. And also I think, again, speaking from my own experience, part of you is angry at different stages, and you're angry that this happened to your family. You're angry, or I was angry about being a caregiver, which is really hard to express, and you feel badly about, because it's nobody's fault this happened. This was the deck of cards you were dealt, but it's a very difficult deck, and it's a very misunderstood. And so I know, and I think it's exacerbated a little bit when people are younger because they look fine. And I used to just kind of really react when people said, oh, I talked to him and he seems fine. And here you are really struggling in a day-to-day basis. But if you spent 10 minutes with him and you just had a very gentle conversation, he would seem fine. And so, but also people didn't know, and they were sort of like, geez, I don't know if I really want to get involved. I'm not sure what I'm doing, what kind of needs he does, and if I can even do that, which is hard to describe. So I'm probably rambling a little bit, but my point is that I think that a lot of what is helpful is for people to spend time with the person with the disease. And that's just really tricky. And especially as things progress, because it does get harder. It does get more complicated. And I can understand why people can feel reticent to do that. I mean, I've even offered to help others and spend time with their loved one, even though their loved one's not as familiar with me, but I am familiar with the disease. But I do think that it can be explained, and people shouldn't feel so intimidated, and that it's sort of behooved on all of us to sort of diminish that the stigma and the fear. But it is tricky because it's very different. And if you haven't spent particularly somebody who's progressed a little bit, it is unique. And I also think that it's really important to have humor. And for somebody who's not directly involved, it may come across as insensitive or callous, and it's really not. I mean, it's a coping mechanism for sure, but you have to appreciate some of the nature of the disease is funny. And when your husband appears and has 7 socks on one foot and none on the other, you got to laugh. And you got to understand, really where memory plays a role in our lives, and you sort of take for granted until you see it happening right in front of you. And so I think, circling back, that's also why it's important to have a network of others going through the same thing. And even others who are sort of maybe even further along. That gets tricky too, though, because people are at different stages as what they're still ready to hear. So for some people, they don't really want to hear it all. It is overwhelming. It's upsetting. It's not a disease that gets better. So you have to be respectful to that too, where people are with their ability to take in that information and hear it. But it's important, I think, to have those supports and find those people in your life that really understand the disease and the experience.
You just talked about something so critical. I think it's this idea of normalizing the experience of spending time with someone with cognitive impairment, but also you just mentioned humor, anger, you described grief, and all of these emotions that caregivers, it's like you're called upon to start this whole new role at a time when you really are emotionally vulnerable. And I think that that's something that we don't talk about enough, which is the emotional weight of caregiving, especially in those early days when you're even just trying to figure out, is this my new life? And what does that mean? Were there any specific services or supports that helped you with some of the emotional hurdles that we live with all the time as caregivers?
Yeah, I mean, again, the support groups are critical. Just to sort of, vent, cry, laugh, whatever emotion was appropriate, or maybe not even appropriate, whatever you're feeling. And I think for me, I was also tried to be aware of, the support group's really not therapy, and that if somebody needs therapy, then they should seek that out. And I would think that might be the case for, anybody, because it is such a unique thing. You don't see it coming. Nobody asks for it. And it is, like I said, very, very unique. And in my experience, also, therapists don't also know about the disease either. So it's kind of a learning curve to realize that people in the medical professions and the social service professions, or even people who have background in dementia but are used to having families where the individual afflicted is a senior, is older, and not really understanding all the realities of how this plays out with early onset. So it becomes a little bit of a give and take in terms of, but if you get a good therapist, they certainly can be very, very helpful. And then, like I said, the community of the support group, a formal support group. And then even, like I said, some of us have branched out on our own. We just meet informally and, joke, laugh, cry, whatever we need to do. And the disease is also very unpredictable. So just when you think you have it down, it changes. We almost sort of talk about it as being like the reverse, almost sort of like the Benjamin Button, the reverse of chronological development, in that people sort of lose, abilities, and the situation gets worse, but that, you learn as you go. And just when you get used to one sort of stage or phase or activity, it changes or the intensity of it increases.
You mentioned Benjamin Button. It's a movie with Brad Pitt, and it has nothing to do with Alzheimer's disease, but I will agree with you. When I watched it, I thought, my goodness, this reverse aging and the retrogenesis there were so many parallels. And so as you talk about that, those supports for mental health, the connections, do you have any messages to the caregivers out there who are also parenting? Because that really is a unique experience of the young onset community.
Yeah, I mean, my first thought is just accept the fact that it's not easy. It just isn't. And there are no easy answers. And it can just be awful. But, and everybody's different, like I said, but, people say, oh, this will make your kids stronger. Well, I just sort of felt like they didn't need that to be stronger. And, for them, people were like, oh, yeah, my grandmother had Alzheimer's. And then, which is horrible as well. But it's a very different experience having a parent, being a child and having your parent have this disease in any form of dementia, and to watch them decline in that kind of way. And then I think it also gets tricky because you sort of function like a single parent, but you also want to be respectful of your spouse, if that's who has the disease, of their dignity and their humanity, and how your children remember them and treat them. I know for me, I was just completely caught up with, we have to make the most of the time that we have now. And I really wanted them to be able to remember them and try to, and the reality is that, they were young and they were only going to be able to remember what they could. I mean, I did tangibly try to do recordings, video, get things on video. We're very fortunate these days, and photographs. But, once, particularly when they're young, if they're symptomatic enough to get diagnosed with the disease, they're already declined, and so I just have to accept that reality as frustrating as it is. So that was one thing that I had to sort of get over. And even speaking with them now, they do struggle with some of the memories of when he was, highly functioning. And I don't have as many recordings of those, because who knew? And actually, he was our family videographer, so he was the one behind the camera. But to encourage people to talk about him, and also it's really hard to get away from the morbidity of it. And I think really it's important to celebrate those experiences you can when you can, and understand, yeah, things are going to get worse, but to make the most of what you do have now. And, I did try to connect the kids with other kids going through the same thing. And it was interesting because it was really hard to find that and to make those connections. And, we're lucky to be in the Boston area where there are a lot of resources and a lot of people who are able to gather in person. And then the Alzheimer's Association did support that need, and we did convene. And what I found was that the kids necessarily, there are different developmental stages and needs in themselves. They didn't necessarily connect and have this sort of, intense insight sharing of the experience of having a parent with the disease, but they did really respond to knowing there were others out there and knowing that they could. And they did create chat rooms where they just sort of did their normal chat stuff, not necessarily directly related to having a parent with dementia. And so I think them knowing others were out there and they could reach out to them if they needed to was really helpful. But I would say that was one of the most, having children and trying to take care of them and their needs and be there for them in a way, that is that much harder because you're being pulled in so many different directions. But it certainly was my priority. So yeah, it's a very, very hard thing to accept and to deal with. And also, I thought they would actually be, I know this is sort of ironic, but I thought they would sort of be nicer to me. And I know that they did appreciate, and they do appreciate, but sometimes I was a little bit of a punching bag. And that, again, I sort of understand that even in the moment, as frustrating as it could be, because they could count on me, and they certainly had their frustrations. And also, they're just teenagers. So, as I always say to anybody, being a kid, being a teenager in this day and age is hard enough under the best of circumstances, whatever that might be. But I guess my big message would be, it is that much harder when you're losing a parent to some form of dementia, and just watching them decline, and accepting that and understanding that as the other parent is just a reality that helps to acknowledge.
In this space, Rhiana, I think there's so much healing in just saying the way that things are, right? That statement, I've heard it many times from people about, well, this will make you or your children stronger, or, people talk about destiny, or just different messages that are positive. But sometimes just embracing, no, what I'm feeling, that this is so tough, that's normal. And, I say a lot that we don't have a cure today for these devastating diseases, but we have a cure right now for the isolation and loneliness that can come along with the diagnosis. And I think you just spoke to that. And, the piece about the struggle, and especially that punching bag, right? You're that safe space for your kids always. I think that that's another endorsement for the role of therapy and mental health, and, engaging with your child's primary care provider, reaching out to the Alzheimer's Association, and looking for family or individualized therapy and counseling services, because no one's going to get over this or fix it, but there are ways to cope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And, every kid's different too. And actually, one of my daughters became very engaged with the advocacy. She's very articulate. She's very outgoing. And it was also very inspiring and rewarding for her. And so she started that at an earlier age, and continued to do that. My other daughter, that wasn't so much, an area that was something she wanted to do. But at the same time, she likes to do artwork. And when somebody wanted to make thousands of purple crane origami, she got involved in that. So, so that's the same thing too. The kids get involved in different ways, and to build their own communities that they're, that are comfortable for them.
I love that. Rhiana, your voice as a part of this session, I really believe it's going to help families feel more connected and less alone. And I hope that because they heard that you were willing to try and connect with the Alzheimer's Association to see what services and supports were right for you, I hope will open someone else's heart to think about connecting in that way. As we close out our time today, I was just wondering, is there anything else that you want to share with our community of young onset families, or is there a takeaway message that you hope a family might take away from listening to your story today?
Like I said, it's not easy, and it can feel very lonely, and it is lonely, and there's only so much anybody can do about that. But there are resources out there. As you said, the Alzheimer's Association has an abundance of resources, websites, support groups, all sorts of different opportunities. But also, the places where your loved one is being seen, Mass General Hospital, which is also where my husband goes. But, we were involved in a program that Boston University Medical School was doing. So a lot of the hospitals, the medical community offer resources, and social workers and support groups. Not as much specific to early onset, but sometimes yes. And sometimes, you make the most of what they can offer, and it's a way to start meeting other people. So I think that it's really hard because the whole thing is so overwhelming, and you're on your learning curve yourself. But once you find that opportunity, find that resource, open that door a crack, you'll see that it doesn't have to be as isolating as inevitably it is, almost just by the nature of the beast. but just finding somebody to talk to, and just realizing that a lot of people's I think the takeaway for me is that some people seem ignorant, and some people even seem like, they don't want to help. They sort of say so, or kind of give you that. And it's not so much, I mean, that was part of what I experienced from family and friends. They just don't know. They're just as overwhelmed as you are. And you don't necessarily have to be the one who educates them. But sometimes it's just you have to understand that there is resources out there that will help. And some of the people that you thought might have been there for you aren't going to be able to. It's just not there for them. And accepting that goes a long way. So for me, in some respects, it was strangers and some of these resources that I was able to identify. They ended up really being my support. And then I ended up almost being the support for some of the loved ones, families, and friends who were just so overwhelmed and distraught and ignorant about the disease. So you just have to figure out where along that whole spectrum of opportunities, communities, and abilities that people have it falls. So, initially I was also very angry at people that they didn't step up, and I thought they should. And now it just took me a while to really understand why they couldn't. And then to identify what is out there. And, I've been at this formally for almost 9 years now. And just the changes that have occurred over those 9 years is very inspiring. And it seems to have even picked up speed. So I'm optimistic. Not only are we going to have some changes in treatment and services, for the disease, but just in a lot of these resources and the understanding of what is needed out there. And like the work, Katie, that you're doing. So there's just a lot of really good people in the field that are really getting at what is still needed and creating those opportunities. And then we get to avail ourselves of them. So thank you.
Thank you, Rhianna. And, I've shared that I have a personal experience with loving and losing someone to dementia. And I found along the way, whether I'm working at MGH, doing policy work on the Hill, or running a support group, there are so many other professionals and clinicians in this field that have a personal connection and a personal story. So know that when you meet with a professional, likely they have had some experience of that love and loss. And it's like you said, there are people that want to help. But I just want to also acknowledge just the incredible empathy that you just expressed for those people in your life who maybe let you down in a one way or another. But that's such an empathetic response. I'm sure it didn't happen overnight, but to just understand that people I think they're doing their best. They just sometimes don't know how to move forward and really make those connections.
Couldn't agree with you more.
Well, this has been a wonderful experience to connect with you today. And I know that it's going to resonate with our community so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you. The MGH Frontotemporal Disorders Unit is a clinical research program dedicated to providing the highest quality of care while working tirelessly towards a cure for frontotemporal degeneration, Alzheimer's disease, and related disorders. Our Community Forum Friday webinars aim to bring information and knowledge to our community of persons living with a diagnosis and their care partners. Thank you all for listening. We hope you stay safe and well, and we'll see you again.